With the Milky Way starting to re-emerge for 2021, I want to make a video sharing the photography techniques that will help you figure out which is the best way for you to capture a nightscape image. The great thing about these techniques is that they could be paired up with each other to help you achieve the best night image possible for just about any situation. So let's jump into it, starting with the basic single exposure. Single exposure nightscape images have become easier to create as cameras over the past decade have vastly improved their low light capabilities. Third-party lens manufacturers have also stepped up their game by making sharper and relatively affordable fast lenses. While single exposures will not boast the best quality compared to other techniques, you can save a lot of processing time and still create a relatively clean image depending on your camera and lens combination. For the best results, a fast aperture like 1.4, 1.8, or a 2.8 is highly recommended for a single exposure night image, and typically you have to crank up the ISO between 3200 and 12800 depending on how dark your location is and your shutter speed. Shutter speed is dependent on how much star blur you're willing to accept in your night image. Single exposure night photography is all about compromise and trade-offs. If you want to keep your ISO lower, then you have to use a longer shutter, which in turn creates more star trailing. Or do you want sharper stars, which may require you to increase your ISO so you could shorten that shutter speed? You have to figure out what gives you the best balance of star movement versus noise in your image. To help you get started, try using the rule of 300, which is 300 divided by the lens focal length, and it gives you a roundabout number for your shutter speed. Now, rules are a great starting point, but by no means are they an obligation, and I highly recommend you experiment with your ISO, shutter speed, and aperture to find the best combination that works for you. Now, for those that want to create cleaner night images, I'm going to make two columns and we're going to look at the night sky and foreground separately. When you treat the sky and the foreground separately, you'll have to blend them back together, but as long as you don't move your tripod, this can be done very easily in post-processing. Column 1 is for the foreground and column 2 is for our Milky Way sky. So in column 1, I'm going to start listing off ways in which we could create cleaner foregrounds, starting off with a longer exposure. A longer exposure is typically achieved using bulb mode and a remote trigger to avoid camera shake. Using bulb mode allows us to gather in more ambient light to illuminate the foreground, and it gives us the ability to stop down a lens so we don't have to shoot wide open, and we could also lower the ISO. A good starting point is an ISO between 800 to 1600 at f4 or f5, and the exposure will vary from 1 to 10 minutes depending on how dark the location is. Just remember that the lower the ISO and the larger the f-stop number will require a much longer exposure time, well past 10 minutes. Next, we have short exposure foreground stacking. This can be done by itself or with the sky as well if you're using a program like Sequator for PCs or Starry Landscape Stacker for Apple computers. Foreground stacking is great if you have to use shorter exposures, but you still want to clean up your foreground. Let's say you don't have a remote trigger, so you're limited to 30-second exposures for your foreground. You could take a series of images to stack in Photoshop or a similar program, effectively simulating a long exposure. Stacking can be done with as few as 2 images or as many as you like. However, typically in my experience, the benefits of noise reduction from foreground stacking is negligible past 15 to 20 images. For the next technique, we're going to combine long exposures with stacking. Why would you want to do this, you ask? Well, in some cases on a hot night, my sensor would heat up quickly, creating hot pixels when taking exposures longer than 2 minutes. In these instances, I would take a long exposure at 1 or 2 minutes to prevent the hot pixels from forming, but the exposure was still too noisy for my liking. I then would take a series of photos and stack them in post-processing, simulating a much longer exposure without the hot pixels and much less noise. Some people ask me about the camera's built-in long exposure noise reduction, which can help remove hot pixels. However, it will double the exposure time. So for example, a 5-minute exposure will now become 10 minutes as your camera takes that additional 5-minute dark frame. I personally prefer the results of just stacking light frames and leaving the exposure noise reduction turned off. However, you should run some tests with your camera to see what works best for you. Next, we have light painting the foreground, which is a great way to lower your ISO and stop down your lens for better sharpness. You can include yourself or just light paint a foreground feature to help accentuate its beauty. You can use constant light or a speed light for a quick flash to help achieve your desired effect. Shutter speed, ISO, and aperture will vary depending on how powerful your light is. Whether it's a long exposure, short exposure, or stacked exposures, light painting can be incorporated into the mix, so be sure to have some fun with it. Another way to light up the scene is by using Moonlight. Now typically we want to shoot the Milky Way during a new moon, however a crescent moon can be used before, during, or after the Milky Way is in position. You can use any foreground exposure technique listed above while the moon is illuminating the foreground for you. The moon will diminish the view of the Milky Way depending on how much light it's reflecting, so it works best to time it when the moon falls before the Milky Way is out, or when the moon rises after you already captured the Milky Way. And my last recommendation for capturing the foreground is during nautical and astronomical twilight. This will allow you to photograph at very low ISOs between 64 to 800 at optimal apertures like f8. The length of the exposure will continue to increase as the light shifts from nautical twilight into astronomical twilight and then eventually darkness. This is great for a clean image, however it can be harder to blend the exposure if it's too bright, too colorful, and too blue. So you may have to desaturate, darken, and warm up your twilight images a little bit to get a more realistic representation of that location at night. Once you get the hang of it in post-processing, photographing during twilight is a great way to capture multiple compositions in a short period of time. Now for the Milky Way, we have several options as well, which can be blended or compositive with any of the foreground capture techniques I mentioned. Let's start off with a single exposure. The noise in the sky of a nightscape image sometimes hides pretty well depending on how you post-process your image. You might be content with the noise and grain in the sky, but you just don't want it in your foreground. You can use any of the foreground techniques I mentioned in column 1 and then follow it up with a single exposure that could be strictly for the sky. As long as you don't move your tripod, you simply create a mask to replace that noisy foreground with a clean one in Photoshop, Affinity, or a similar program. This technique served me well for a couple of years until portable star trackers and stacking software became available. Next we have Milky Way Stacking. Now before programs like Starry Landscape Stacker and Sequator were created, we had to manually align the Milky Way using Photoshop, but stacking the Milky Way has become a breeze because of Starry Landscape Stacker and Sequator, which does a fantastic job separating the sky from the foreground, stacking the images it separated, and then piecing them back together into one clean photo. And as I stated earlier, around 15 photos will give you a fabulous result compared to a single exposure. Since stacking greatly reduces noise, it allows you to use shorter exposures for sharper stars without fear of using a high ISO. Now while these programs do a great job, you can further improve the foreground by combining it with some of the other foreground techniques I mentioned in column 1. Another way to get great detail and sharpness in your Milky Way is by using a star tracker. They've become more affordable than ever and are relatively compact nowadays. Star trackers allow you to take longer exposures for up to several minutes depending on how well you polar align your tracker. Since the tracker is slowly rotating to counteract the rotation of the Earth, star trackers will create a blurry foreground, so it will require more time to composite your final image. They also will take up some weight and real estate in your camera bag, which is something to keep in mind when traveling. Now the amazing results you get from a star tracker are well worth the trade-off of lugging around some extra gear. Star trackers also allow you to use slower lenses, or you could stop down your fast lenses to f4 to increase your corner-to-corner sharpness. Or you could also shoot wide open, allowing you to reduce your ISO considerably. Again, you'll have to experiment to find the balance of what's acceptable for you when it comes to noise and sharpness. I personally want to increase the sharpness while I use a star tracker, so I stop the lens down to f4 or f5. This may require me to still use an ISO between 2000 and 4000, depending on how long my shutter can stay open for. For this reason, I started using the last technique on this list, which is tracking and stacking. I track the Milky Way, giving me sharp results, and my ISO is a little higher than I want it to be, so I take several consecutive photos, usually 3 to 5, and I will stack them. The great thing about Sequator and Starry Landscape Stacker is that they can also stack just the sky by itself if need be. There are also several other programs for astrophotography that will stack the Milky Way and other celestial objects as well. So looking at these two columns, you can mix and match how you want to create your nightscape images. There's going to be a time when certain techniques will work better than others, and as you become more experienced, you'll know when to choose the best combination for the best results. I've done videos covering just about all of these methods of nightscape photography, so if you need any further detail on any of them, leave a comment below and I'll direct you to the right video to help you out. Lastly, if I missed any techniques that you think works really well for nightscapes, leave it in the comment section below. And as always, I hope this helps you guys out, and happy Milky Way hunting.